They cracked open a door that hadn't been touched in over 2,000 years. What they found inside wasn't treasure. It wasn't scrolls or pottery or any of the usual archaeological hits. What they found was something that made seasoned researchers physically recoil. And the more they uncovered, the worse it got. This is the story of Petra's sealed chamber. And trust me, you're not ready for where this goes. You know Petra. Even if you think you don't, you do. It's that rose-red city carved into Jordanian cliffs that shows up in every adventure movie from Indiana Jones to Transformers. The treasury facade, that jaw-dropping entrance that looks like someone told an ancient civilization to build a building, but they said, nah, we'll just carve one out of a mountain instead. Peak showing off. But here's the thing about Petra. We've been staring at its postcards for decades while completely missing the point. The treasury, the monastery, all those Instagram-famous facades, they're not buildings. They're doors. Or more accurately, they're the most elaborate keep-out signs in human history. Because Petra isn't a city. It's a necropolis. Really pretty from the outside. The Nabateans who built this place between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD weren't exactly subtle about their architectural flex. They controlled the incense trade routes, made obscene amounts of money, and decided to spend it on carving an entire civilization into sandstone. Smart? Absolutely. Practical? Debatable. Cool as hell. Undeniably. But while tourists have been snapping selfies at the treasury for the past century, archaeologists have been finding things that don't make it into the brochures. Sealed chambers that were meant to stay sealed. Ritual spaces that suggest the Nabateans had some pretty intense religious practices. And now in late 2025, they found the big one. The discovery happened almost by accident. A team from Brown University and the Jordanian Department of Antiquities were doing routine ground-penetrating radar scans near the Street of Facades when their equipment started screaming about an anomaly. Not just a tomb. Not just another carved space. Sealed. And sitting about 40 feet beneath one of the minor facades that tourists walk past without a second glance. Here's where it gets interesting. The Nabateans were obsessed with making their tombs visible. Show-offy visible. Look at how rich I was visible. So when they seal something and then hide it, that's not normal. That's intentional obscurity. That's the ancient equivalent of password protecting a file, and then deleting the password. The excavation took 3 months. 3 months of carefully removing 2,000 years of sediment, debris, and deliberately placed stone blocks. And yeah, they found blocks. Not just a sealed door. Not just a collapsed entrance. Deliberately stacked stones, meant to ensure whatever was inside stayed inside. Red flag number 1. When they finally broke through in early December 2025, the first thing that hit them wasn't a sight. It was a smell. After 2 millennia, you'd expect stale air, maybe some mineral odors from the rock. What they got was something organic, something that shouldn't have survived that long but somehow had. The project lead described it as wrong. Not unpleasant. Like the air itself had been preserved in a state it was never meant to be in. Red flag number 2. The chamber itself defied expectations. Most Nabatean tombs follow a pattern. Central chamber, burial niches carved into walls, maybe some decorative elements if the deceased was particularly wealthy. Clean. Organized. Respectful of the dead. This chamber was chaos. The space was roughly 60 feet across and 20 feet high, carved with the typical Nabatean precision. But the walls? The walls were covered in inscriptions, floor to ceiling, every available surface, and not the usual funerary texts either. These were warnings. Prohibitions. The Nabatean script essentially saying over and over, do not disturb, cursed be those who enter. Sealed by divine command. You know how in horror movies someone finds a room covered in warning messages and decides to keep going anyway? Archaeologists are basically those people with PhDs. The floor was even stranger. Most Nabatean burial chambers have relatively flat floors, maybe some carved depressions for offerings. Deliberately cut channels forming a perfect geometric pattern that all converge toward the center of the room. And in those channels? Residue. Chemical analysis is still ongoing, but preliminary results suggest a mix of animal blood, myrrh, frankincense, and something else they can't quite identify. A lot of liquids. At the center of the room sat 12 stone pedestals arranged in a circle. Each pedestal held a ceramic vessel, And this is where things get properly disturbing. The vessels were intact, sealed with a combination of wax and bitumen that had somehow survived perfectly. And they were heavy. Way heavier than empty pottery should be. Protocol said document everything before touching anything. So they did. Photographs, measurements, 3D scans, the works. The whole time, multiple team members reported feeling uneasy. Not scared, exactly, just deeply uncomfortable, like standing in a space that fundamentally rejected human presence. When they finally opened the first vessel, they found bones. Human bones. But not a burial. Not even close. The bones had been deliberately broken, crushed almost, then packed into the vessel with more of that aromatic resin mixture. The bones weren't from one person. DNA analysis suggests at least 3 different individuals in that single jar. All 12 vessels contained the same thing. Crushed human remains. Multiple individuals per container. Sealed with a mixture designed to preserve them indefinitely. And these weren't recent. Carbon dating puts them contemporary with the chamber's construction, roughly 1st century AD. Now the Nabateans practiced secondary burial sometimes. That's when you let a body decompose naturally, then collect the bones for final interment. It's weird by modern standards, but archaeologically speaking pretty normal for the ancient world. But this wasn't that. The bones showed signs of being processed while fresh, broken systematically, arranged deliberately. This was ritual activity. And whatever ritual it wasn't about honoring the dead. The chamber contained no valuables. No jewelry, no coins, no trade goods. In a culture that routinely buried their elite with enough gold to fund a small army, this absence speaks volumes. This wasn't a tomb. This was something else entirely. Between the pedestals, they found the remains of what appeared to be elaborate rope or cord work, mostly disintegrated, but enough survived to reconstruct the pattern. The vessels had been connected, tied together in a specific configuration that matched symbols carved into the floor. And at the center of it all, a stone altar. Small, maybe 2 feet across, but carved with incredible detail. The altar depicts a scene that doesn't match any known Nabatean religious iconography. It shows figures, human figures arranged in postures of what can only be described as supplication or terror, or might be the artist's attempt to represent something they literally couldn't comprehend. Whatever it is, it's receiving something from the human figures, and that something looks disturbingly like their life force being drawn out. Dramatic? Sure, but that's genuinely what's carved there. The Nabateans weren't big on horror imagery. Their art is typically pretty straightforward. Gods look like gods. Humans look like humans. Everyone's proportions are reasonable. This altar is the exception. This altar looks like someone carved a nightmare. The inscriptions on the walls provided more context, and honestly made things worse. The longest continuous text translates roughly to a record of a ritual performed to seal away the hungry darkness, and bind that which seeks to unmake. It describes 12 volunteers, or possibly sacrifices whose remains would serve as eternal guardians against something trying to break through from beneath. From beneath. That's the phrase used. Not from outside, not from the afterlife, not from the realm of the gods. From beneath, under Petra. Now before we go full Lovecraftian cosmic horror, let's talk geology. Petra sits in a seismically active region. The Nabateans knew this. They experienced earthquakes. A major one in 363 AD basically ended Petra as a functioning city. So it's entirely possible that beneath refers to some very real geological phenomenon they didn't have the scientific framework to understand. But here's where it gets properly weird. Ground-penetrating radar of the area around the chamber shows anomalies. Not more chambers, not tombs, not carved spaces. Voids. Natural cavities in the rock extending deep into the earth. Really deep. Deeper than any caves or natural formations should reasonably exist in this type of sandstone geology. One void in particular sits almost directly beneath the sealed chamber. Maybe 100 feet down. It's massive, roughly the size of a cathedral. And it shouldn't exist. The rock composition in this area doesn't form those kinds of cavities naturally. Yet, there it is. A huge empty space that apparently the Nabateans not only knew about but were terrified of. The research team set up equipment to monitor the chamber continuously while they worked. Seismographs, to detect any ground movement, air quality sensors, temperature gauges, the works. On the third night after opening the chamber, all the seismographs registered an event simultaneously. Not an earthquake, something else. A vibration, low frequency, lasting approximately 40 seconds, emanating from beneath the chamber. It repeated the next night. Same duration, same frequency, like clockwork. Now, there are rational explanations for underground vibrations. Water flow through rock, gas escaping from pockets, settling sediment. Lots of natural processes that could cause this. But the precision bothered people. Natural processes aren't usually that regular. The team brought in a specialized cave exploration unit to investigate the void. Professional spelunkers with all the high-tech gear. They descended through a natural crack in the rock about 200 feet from the chamber. The void was accessible, barely, through a series of increasingly narrow passages that looked like they'd been partially collapsed deliberately. What they found down there doesn't have a good explanation. The main cavity was natural. Yes, sandstone worn away by ancient water flow. But someone had been down there. Recently, 1st century AD recently, the same era as the sealed chamber. The floor of the cavity was covered in ash, feet of it, not from a single fire, from hundreds of fires, maybe thousands, burned over what must have been years or decades. And in that ash, more bones. Lots more bones, both human and animal, all showing the same signs of ritual processing seen in the vessels upstairs. On one wall of the cavity, someone had carved a message, just one sentence in Nabatean script. It translates to, "We fed it until it slept." The implications are uncomfortable. Either the Nabateans believed something lived down there that required regular sacrifices to keep dormant, or something did live down there and they found a way to deal with it that we'd prefer not to think about too hard. The sealed chamber wasn't a tomb. It was a capstone, a ritual lock placed over something they couldn't destroy but could contain. The 12 vessels weren't burials. They were metaphysical batteries, if we want to get weird about it. The remains of people who supposedly volunteered or were chosen to serve as eternal guardians. Their essence bound to keep whatever was below from coming up. Whether you buy into that supernatural interpretation or not, the archaeological fact remains. The Nabateans, a sophisticated culture with advanced engineering, complex trade networks, and elaborate religious practices, put enormous effort into sealing something. They broke every one of their normal burial customs to do it. They hid it. They warded it. They left warnings that would make modern hazardous waste markers look subtle, and then they deliberately collapsed the access tunnels to the void below. Not all of them, obviously, since the cave team found a way in, but enough that casual exploration was impossible. They wanted that space inaccessible. They wanted whatever was down there to stay down there, and they wanted their warning chamber to remain sealed until, presumably, the end of time. The Jordanian government has been understandably cautious about how much information gets released. Petra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a massive tourist draw. Hey, we found a horrifying ritual chamber that might be sealing away an ancient evil isn't exactly great for the tourism board, but the archaeological community is quietly losing its mind, because this find suggests Nabatean religion was way more complex and way darker than anyone previously understood. We thought we had them figured out. Trade-focused, pragmatic, borrowed heavily from Greek and Egyptian religious practices. Nothing too exotic. This chamber says otherwise. The artifacts have been removed for study. The vessels, the altar, samples of everything they could safely take. The chamber itself remains accessible but is now under 24-hour security. Not to protect it from looters, to monitor it, because those seismic events, they haven't stopped. Every night, same time, same duration, same frequency. Something down there is regular, and nobody knows what. The academic papers are still being written. Carbon dating, DNA analysis, chemical composition studies, everything's ongoing. But the preliminary findings are consistent. This was a major ritual site. This represented a significant investment of resources. This mattered desperately to the people who created it, and they sealed it for a reason. There's talk of exploring the deeper voids, mapping the full extent of the cavity system beneath Petra, understanding what the Nabateans were so worried about. But there's also significant pushback from local authorities who think disturbing the site further is disrespectful, from religious groups who think some things are sealed for good reason, From scientists who argue that the structural integrity of Petra itself could be compromised by extensive underground exploration. The debate continues. But here's what we know for sure. Petra's sealed chamber contained the remains of at least 36 individuals, ritually processed and arranged as guardians. It was built to last forever. It was hidden deliberately. And the people who built it believed they were containing something that absolutely could not be allowed to escape. Whether they were right or wrong, we just broke their seal. We opened their lock. We've let air and light into a space that was meant to remain dark and sealed until the stone itself crumbled to dust. The Nabateans left warnings. Maybe we should have listened.